Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving into Path of Exile 2 0.4 The Last of the Druids, or the fate of the Vol League that launched December 12 with the massive hype for the new Druid class, shapeshifting talisman and customizable Val Temple dungeon mechanic. But beneath of the new Oracle and Shaman ascendancies lies a patch riddled with flaws that expose PoE2's deepest identity crisis. A game desperate to reinvent the RPG formula, but trapped in the technical issues and the bug issues, imbalanced slow gameplay, and unfun mechanics that take away from what Path of Exile is at its deeper core. Path of Exile 0.4 does not struggle because it lacks depth or ambition. In many ways it has more systems, more interactions, and more mechanical demands than ever before. The issue is not quantity but direction. The game increasingly asks players to engage with complexity that does not translate into a meaningful choice, and that disconnect sits at the heart of its design problems. To understand why this matters, it's important to clarify how Path of Exile 2 differs philosophically from Path of Exile 1. In Path of Exile 1, players primarily express their decisions through build construction. The challenge was in designing an engine, an interconnected system of skills, triggers, and scaling that will give feedback once combat began. Execution existed, but it was secondary to preparation. The game rewarded foresight and creativity, and combat is served as a stage where those decisions played out. Path of Exile 0.4 takes a different approach. Here the player is still expected to design an engine, but instead of proper feedback, the game requires the player to manually operate every component of that engine in real time. Skills are no longer expression of the build alone, there are steps in the sequence that must be repeatedly executed correctly to maintain effectiveness. At the first glance, this appears to increase depth. After all, more buttons and more responsibility should mean more skill. The problem is that once optimal patterns emerge, the player is no longer making decisions in response to combat situation. They are maintaining a solved procedure. Over time, most effective builds in Path of Exile 2 0.4 settle into familiar rhythm. The player performs a set of actions to enable damage, maintains conditions that keep the build functional, and then spends accumulated resources during brief windows of the peak output. The structure is not inherently bad, but it becomes problematic when the game consistently rewards mastering the sequence itself rather than responding dynamically to enemies or environments. And your build itself, it always feels like you never step ahead, but are always pushed back to the corner when everything should play off towards the direction of your build. The result is a gameplay that feels busy rather than thoughtful. The player attention is consumed by internal obligation, timers, resources states, and condition to upkeep, rather than external threats. Combat becomes less about interpreting what is happening on the screen and more about ensuring that nothing in the internal loop fails off the alignment. This leads directly to the second issue. Difficulty in Path of Exile 2 is often created through cognitive load rather than strategic pressure. The game frequently challenges the player by asking them to track multiple independent systems simultaneously. Success depends on remembering which ability enables which effect empowers which skill, and how long each component remains active. When failure occurs, it's often not because the player misunderstood the enemy or made a poor tactical decision, but because one part of the sequence was mistimed or forgotten. This kind of difficulty does not foster creativity or adaptation. Instead, it rewards repetition and muscle memory. Players improve not by discovering new approaches, but by internalizing a fixed routine and executing it more reliably. Once learned, that routine rarely changes because deviation is usually punished rather than encouraged. As a result, build diversity begins to collapse, not in appearance but in a function. Path of Exile 2 offers many skills and customization options, yet many builds behave nearly identically. Once combat begins, different animation, themes, and visual mask the fact that players are often performing the same underlying actions in the same order with the same goals. The surface level variety remains, but creative and experimental variety diminishes. This convergence is not caused by lack of imagination among players. It emerged naturally from systems that reward efficiency above all else. When multiple playstyles exist, but only a narrow subset allows players to engage with content comfortably, experimentation becomes a liability rather than an opportunity. This is compounded by persistent mismatch between effort and reward. Many mechanics in Path of Exile 2 demand precision, setup and risk. Long animation lock players in place. Conditional damage requires careful timing. Some skills ask the player to expose themselves to danger before any payoff occurs. However, the rewards for this effort often fail to meaningfully exceed what simple and more reliable approach can achieve. This is compounded by persistent mismatch between effort and reward. Many mechanics in Path of Exile 2 demand precision, setup and risk. Long animation lock players in place. Conditional damage requires careful timing. Some skills ask the player to expose themselves to danger before any payoff occurs. However, the rewards from this effort often fail to meaningfully exceed what simple and more reliable approach can achieve. Over time, players learn the lesson the game teaches them. Complexity is optional, but efficiency is mandatory. Expressive or thematic builds fall away not because they are impossible, but because they feel irrational to pursue. When the game repeatedly discourages players from engaging with its most intricate system, those systems begin to feel ornamental rather than essential. And pacing of this game doesn't really help, but reinforces this problem. Combat in Path of Exile 2 frequently oscillates between moments of constraint and moments of overwhelming power. Outside of optimal condition, the player feels limited, waiting on the cooldowns, resources or setup. Once everything aligns, enemies are erased quickly, sometimes before meaningful interactions can occur. Power exists in spikes rather than in gradients. This binary state undermines tension. Instead of danger emerging from evolving combat scenarios, it emerges from whenever the player internal systems are correctly active, and the damage becomes predictable: wait, prepare, unleash, repeat. All of those issues point to a larger, more fundamental problem. Path of Exile 2 does not clearly commit to a single design identity. It borrows the complexity and story crafting heritage of Path of Exile 1, but removes much of the automation. It borrows the complexity and story crafting heritage of Path of Exile 1, but removes much of the feedback that made that complexity expressive. At the same time, it adopts the execution demands of slower, more tactical action games, without reducing systemic overhead too much. The result is the game that asks players to think like designers, execute action like Souls-like tryhards, and optimize like they playing real-time strategy, often simultaneously. That expectation is unsustainable for the most players. The long-term risk is not immediate backlash, but gradual disengagement. When systems feel restrictive rather than empowering, players stop experimenting. When combat becomes procedural, it stops surprising. And when a game's depth no longer translates into enjoyment, players leave quietly. Path of Exile 0.4 is not broken because it's incomplete. It's flawed because the system increasingly solve themselves, then ask the player to manually maintain those solutions indefinitely. Until the game decides whatever it wants to prioritize expression or execution, creativity or control, it will continue to struggle. Not with balance, but with purpose. Wish you best, Exile. See you in the next video.